I'm Dr. Pete Economo, the East Coast psychologist,
And I'm Dr. Nikki Rubin, the West Coast psychologist.
and this is When East.
Meets West.
Well, behaviorism is everything. And this episode, Nikki, we're going to talk about how really there's nothing void of behaviorism in any experience that we have.
Yeah, that's right, because everything that we do is behavior. And maybe if someone's listening to this going like, okay, Nikki, that's pretty, pretty darn
You
obvious.
you think you're so smart.
Yeah, you think you're so smart. I'd be like, yeah, well, but we got to be, I like to operationalize things. So we got to be really concrete and clear here that everything that we do is behavior. And I don't think that's something that not only the average Joe recognizes, but actually the average clinician doesn't even recognize that sometimes, right? That
Well,
everything.
maybe that's one of our episodes about like the different schools of thought. But I think because we're typically like cognitive behavioral therapists, like we're the cult. It's
Yeah, we like to focus on behavioral science, but I would say even within cognitive behavioral therapy, I mean, the example I'll give is that there have oftentimes been like infighting in our community about what how do we define behavior, and sort of like the second wave, the older school CBT therapists will talk about thoughts as their own thing, and it's like,
yeah,
yes, you can have a thought, and that could be like a thing in your mind. Thinking is a behavior, though. It's
that's
not a
right.
behavior we can see. It's a covert behavior, as I've talked about here
We
before.
certainly
But
have. Yeah,
thinking is a behavior. Imagining is a behavior.
yeah,
You know,
yeah.
running is a behavior. Crying is a behavior.
And one of the things I always struggle with that is like stop thought. It's like, and that's for
Can't,
the second wave. It's like I don't know. I haven't learned any way of stopping my thoughts. Have
no,
you?
we can't. No, because it's like that's a behavior that's ongoing. That's
It's
actually
ongoing,
part of our, well, and it's an involuntary behavior. So like
right?
we could get really detailed here. Like your heart beating, like
Yeah,
that's a behavior. You don't
yeah,
control that behavior, right? But
that's
it's
right.
that's something that's
Well,
happening.
so what I wonder is, do you think our thoughts
Oh,
continue
actually,
after what? Oh, go.
oh, I just realized I backed myself into a corner here because I'm like, it's a behavior, but I always talk about you can control behavior. So actually, I take that back. Your heart beating, I would say, is not a behavior because it's an involuntary process in the body.
Oh, oh, I see what you're saying. But and then the thoughts are the
Yeah.
same way.
Well, but thoughts, yeah, but thoughts, we do have agency. You can choose to think about
Well, see,
things.
I say we have control over nothing.
We'll see, but that's where, but like right now, when
Yeah,
you just raised up your hand, Pete and I can see each other on Zoom here. You chose to do that,
I did.
right? So
Yeah,
that we have
we
agency
can,
over
and we
that.
can't choose, or we can't choose to think or choose not to think.
Yeah, oh, so this is where, oh, we're really gonna get sticky here,
Maybe we're
right?
getting
So
sticky.
yeah,
Yeah,
we're getting sticky. We can't choose thoughts that just show up. So that can be involuntary. That can
you're right.
just
Automatic
pop
thought,
in.
we would call that.
Automatic thought, right? An
Right.
automatic thought or like an intrusive image.
And
Things can just
intrusive thoughts
pop
as well,
in.
or images. Yeah,
But what happens next, what we do, we
correct.
control.
That's
So
the
we could,
behavior.
that's the behavior.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
we
yeah.
could start to go like, I'm going to think about this, I don't know, sandwich I want to have for lunch. Like maybe a
Right.
tuna sandwich popped into
And
your
I'm on a
mind.
diet or something like that.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Or you don't have any tuna in your house and you're like, well, I can't make a tuna sandwich, right?
Right. Yeah.
So
Yeah. Well,
every
okay.
yeah.
We got in the weeds a little bit, but I think the way I look at it, especially, okay, I'll bring in the Buddhism. So thoughts are thoughts. There's no control over them. What you do is you build a relationship with them. They're loud. And so one of the things I talk about is that we can maybe look at the volume of it. Right. And
Mhm.
so like I could potentially lower the volume of my thoughts, but
Mhm.
that I really can't control them. And I actually don't use the word control at all in my
Yes.
treatment. So there's no, like, I don't use the word, it's a verb to control.
Mhm.
And you might try to, but I don't think it's really that effective. So I think what we do in
Mhm.
third wave, especially in Buddhism, is we learn to exist with our thoughts. Our thoughts are very creative. And
Mhm.
so they're not always great, and they'll tempt us, like
Yep.
if I'm on a diet and I'm like, I want a burger, says the vegetarian, like, or something
Right.
that maybe that I'm trying to avoid because I have high cholesterol or something like that.
Right.
You're
Right.
going to be tempted.
Yes,
Your
totally.
thoughts will tempt. And so I think what we're getting here is everything's behaviorism. And it's what I was going to say about the heart is like, I don't know if our thoughts stop when our heart stops. I'm gonna just put that out there. Let that
Right.
sit
Oh yeah.
there.
I was gonna say now I love when we start getting into like and now we get into consciousness.
There we get
Now
into
we're like,
consciousness.
yeah,
Yeah.
yes.
And the
Right. No,
philosophy of
and the
behaviorism.
philosophy is, yeah, we
Yeah.
don't know that. So
We don't
well,
know.
and so when we're saying behaviorism, when we go everything is behaviorism, it's like maybe what's more, again, to be more clear, is like everything is behavior. And then Western behavioral science, we have a well-established, well-studied scientific framework that helps us understand how behaviors are learned,
Right.
right? And how behaviors are maintained, meaning why do we continue to do them?
So
And
before you give us a lesson on
yeah,
that,
oh, I
what I'm
will.
just going to
Yeah.
say is I think that referencing back to the cognitive cult is we have a lot of also random control trials. So in
Hmm.
CBT, because we're somewhat manualized, right? We can look at what we do in a manualized way when compared to other types of therapies, it might be just more subjective and in the
Hmm.
moment. I
Hmm.
think I bring that into my work, but the truth
Hmm.
is what I'm doing is still based on learning theory. And that's just why that's some of the basis of the cognitive cult language, because we do have the most evidence-based empirical studies, showing the efficacy of the interventions that you and I talk about here on this podcast.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. And I would say actually, like, just to clarify, historically there were manuals, right? But actually
Yeah.
in third wave, we've actually like significantly moved away from that
Yeah.
because, as our listeners might guess, humans don't fit well into a box of a manual, and that's
Yeah.
often been a criticism, rightly so, of cognitive behavioral therapies.
Sure.
And the more modern approaches have really emphasized, again, how do these behavioral science principles, how can they be flexibly applied to complex human beings that we actually
Coming
don't need,
back to
like,
flexibility.
yeah, come back to flexibility. And then that's something, as we've talked about in the podcast before, has also been well studied as the more psychologically flexible someone is, it's highly correlated with psychological well-being. And then the
Yes.
inverse is true. The more inflexible someone is psychologically, it's that's highly correlated with psychopathology.
Yes. Yeah, and
Right.
so I think what we've talked about in Buddhism, we look at flexibility around. I mean, this Dalai Lama has looked at some more like neurological pathways and how actually flexibility can now be sort of seen with some
Hmm.
imaging. We could
Yep.
see changes
Yep.
in certain areas of the brain. So again, I think for listeners, just trying to think about ways to do it. So give us a little rundown of sort of learn and maintain. So you talked about behaviorism in general. Western behavioral science looks at how behaviors are learned and maintained or punished, which we'll
Yes.
get into too.
Absolutely. So I'll do the first one that I think most people are familiar with, which is I would say most people have heard of Pavlov's dogs,
I think
right?
so.
Pavlov was a guy who basically found that he was like running some kind of other study, and he found that when these dogs he was studying, when he brought out food to feed them, their breakfast or dinner or whatever, he rang a bell,
Yeah.
and the dogs would salivate. And eventually, he started to notice that the dogs would salivate when they heard the bell, even though the food wasn't there. And
Right.
so that was the start of this learning theory that's referred to as classical conditioning, which basically means the brain can learn to associate literally
Yes.
anything,
Yeah.
honestly, anything with what are already considered involuntary bodily processes. So, like salivation, increased heart rate, like even like eye blinking, certain things that we don't choose to do, they're involuntary. But our bodies can learn to have those responses to things that are unrelated. So, I always like to share an example of like when I was a grad student and I was working with like some very suicidal patients.
Yeah.
Um, I had a certain cell phone ring that I used to have,
Oh, yeah.
and I
Ah,
would get
this is a
called
good one.
on that
Yeah.
number. Yeah, I would
Yeah.
get called on that number by some people that were really suicidal. And my reaction, understandably, would be like, it's involuntary when somebody you care about is in danger. I
Yeah.
was scared. And so I would sweat and my heart would increase.
Yeah.
And so I had to eventually change when I left that training site. I had to change my cell phone ring because
Yeah.
every time I heard that ring, and to this day, if someone has that ring, my body
You remember.
reacts.
Yeah.
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 Right.
That's a perfect example. Yeah. And,
Yeah.
and and people listening could think about that with smells. Maybe it
Yep.
reminds you of like a grandparent or,
Mm-hmm.
all of the senses will trigger certain memories and both good and bad. And so I think within third wave and Buddha, like third wave CBT and Buddhism, we look at just radical acceptance of what is. And
Mm-hmm.
so like, and so again, everything's behaviorism. Like if I work with an injured athlete, like people think, well, that's PT and it's medicine. Well, it's also like mindset. There's
Mm-hmm.
evidence that the behavior I approach my recovery will impact my prognosis to recovery.
Mhm,
There,
mhm.
there's a big line there. So all right. So that's how things are learned. What about you want to go
Well,
maintenance, punishment?
Well, I
Go
was going
ahead.
to say what you just shared is it was a nice segue into like another part of behaviorism. So classical conditioning is how we can our brain can be conditioned to learn certain things.
Right.
There's also a type of behavioral learning theory called operant conditioning,
Yeah.
and this is something I would say most people are maybe more familiar with because it's the kind of it's the kind of behavioral theory used when, as we mentioned in our our dogs and well-being episode. That is used when training animals,
That's right.
right? And so that this has to do, you can learn behaviors this way, and it also can maintain certain behaviors
Right.
by accessing these principles. So these have to do with reinforcement and punishment. And I always get really bummed out because these are sort of like the most widely misunderstood
Yeah.
principles. And same thing, not just with the average Joe, but also actually clinicians I often come across don't understand it as well,
Yeah.
right? So basically, what reinforcement means is that if a behavior is reinforced, it means it's more likely to happen again.
That's
That's
right.
all it means.
Yeah.
If a behavior is punished, it means a behavior is less likely to happen again. That's
Yep.
all it means. So it's not good or bad, right or wrong. It's just behavior is more likely to occur or less likely to occur,
That's right.
right? So, you know, when we talk about positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement, it doesn't mean what most people think it does. It's like they're terribly named, in my opinion, right?
I know.
Positive doesn't mean good, and negative doesn't mean bad.
That's right.
Positive in operant conditioning means we add something to the situation,
That's right.
and negative means we take something away.
Yeah.
So if I want to train my dog to learn to shake, and I want to positively reinforce him, I'm going to grab his paw and say shake, and then I'm going to give him a cookie. I've
That's right.
added something. And when he
Right.
gets the cookie, it means he's more likely to give me his paw next time,
Right.
right? Negative
It'll take several
learning
trials.
trials,
Yep.
right? I'll take many trials. He's not
Yep.
going to he's not that smart. He's not going to learn it on in one trial. Negative reinforcement means we take something away. So let's say somebody in my neighborhood is afraid of dogs,
Yeah.
and every time they walk by me, and my dog Toby, he's very large. He's like 110 pounds, even though he's a gentle giant. They don't know that,
They don't know that.
right? They feel afraid.
Yeah.
And so if they're walking on the same side of the street as me, and they decide, oh, that's
Cross
scary,
the
I'm
street.
going to cross the street.
Yeah.
Guess what? Their anxiety goes away.
Yeah.
And what does that do? It teaches their brain that they're more likely next time
Yes.
they see a dog to avoid. That's
Yeah.
what negative reinforcement is. Any other
Beautiful.
examples you'd add before I jump into punishment here?
Go to punishment because I
Go
think
to
because
punishment.
then we'll go to like the real life. We'll give more examples. So go to punishment.
Okay. So punishment also I think widely misunderstood because it's colloquially used obviously as like I'm going to punish someone, right? Like I'm going to do something bad to them. But again, in behaviorism it just means that a behavior is less likely to occur. So punishment's not used a lot in therapy because it doesn't teach new behavior. It just suppresses behavior.
That's
So
right.
here's an example. And I'll use a positive punishment example. So again, positive, remember, we've added something. It doesn't mean good. So if you get a ticket while speeding on the freeway, and if you're in LA and you're speeding on the 405 and you get a fine, right? Woo, the 405. That's positive punishment. Something's been added, you're given a fine, and you're less likely to speed on the 405 going forward. But
Right.
here's the thing, it doesn't teach you not to speed. You get on the 10 freeway, you might, hit 90 miles an hour, no problem, right?
That's right.
So positive punishment, it has a place. It's not very effective at honestly like teaching people newer adaptive behaviors. It just kind of temporarily suppresses the behavior you don't want. Negative punishment is where we take things away. This is often used like with children, right? Like taking stimuli away. So, if a kid goes on a timeout, right? Because they've like thrown all their toys all over. And so you put them in a boring room in the house to have you're removing negative, taking away. You're taking away the stimuli. The exciting stuff to hopefully reduce that behavior of tossing their toys around.
Yep.
So that's my little lesson. Hopefully that's clear for everybody. So
well, it's probably not. I mean, I know a lot of times. I mean, it is, and I appreciate it. But I think when we're just regular human beings in the world, we're not always thinking about these things, and that's why, God bless her, your English major undergraduate dogs, Lola, was not the best behaved.
Nope.
It's even knowing all these principles. So I think
yeah, you can't do it. Knowing them doesn't mean that you execute them perfectly. I think is what you're trying to say. Yeah. Because and I think that the reason though I always want to be really clear, and I often share some of this psychoed with with patients,
Oh,
because I
sure.
feel like that's the thing, is because everything we do is behavior, actually really understanding what's happening gives you
That's
more
right.
opportunity to choose how you respond. So it doesn't mean it's going to go perfectly,
That's right.
right? We, humans, animals, we're all complex organisms, though it might help you make choices about what you do next that
That's right.
might work a little bit more effectively than just, you know, doing
And that's
whatever
the way we
feels
look at
easy.
it, is like right or wrong. It's not right or wrong. It's just
No.
effective. I find myself using that language a lot too. It's like, can I be effective? Can I find effective communication? Things like that. And so,
Right.
really, there's nothing that, in my opinion, that does not include behaviorism. Everything we do is behaviorism. Politics, my job in academia, sports, going to the gym just for my own sort of self-care or personal growth, holidays, so we're recording this right after Thanksgiving, and then as we get into the December holiday season for whatever you celebrate, and there's a lot of behaviorism in the holidays.
We'll say more about like why, because I think maybe like hearing sort of, so I just kind of gave like the drier, like concrete info about, what behavioral science is. And then, you're saying like, well, this applies to everything. And I'm sure
Yeah.
there are people listening going like, okay, but like how?
Yeah.
Like how does this apply? How does this apply to everything that I do?
Yeah, so like my nieces having crayons by the couch, which like their mother's like, no crayons by the couch, and I'm just like, oh, what's the crayon for? And then just trying to like either like reward them for not coloring on the couch, whereas mom's like trying to grab it away, which is avoidance, and then takes away even the opportunity for them to mess up. And I'm gonna just do some scaffolding of like, what's the crayon for? Here's a piece of paper, and if you happen to color on your couch like you did last time you were here, I'll clean it, it will come off. Like
Hmm.
couches are made
Yes.
pretty strong these days.
So you're
Uh,
thinking about different things to reinforce
yes,
and different things to, and this is another behavioral term, extinguish,
to
right? To,
extinguish, right?
to which and extinguish basically means we stop reinforcing something.
Like
So
I
you
don't
stop.
want them to draw on the couch.
So you're not going to give that attention. You're not going to
That's right.
give that
I'm not going to
reinforcer.
be like, no, 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 grab it away and did it right, because then
Well,
they're more.
which
Yeah,
and that's what people get confused about, right? Because they think
correct.
like if I say no, 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 but what they forget is that that's
No, no, no
adding
is
something.
attention.
It's attention, right? And
Yeah,
attention is
yeah.
a very potent reinforcer,
It
right?
certainly is, and I think that we see that a lot and that's where like I
Yeah.
think I value the foundation of psychology, where it's like attachment
Hmm.
theory, birth
Hmm.
order, and so
Hmm.
that's helpful data. So
Yes.
like if I have a last born client and they're like emotionally dysregulated and look for attention in their relationship, well, it makes sense because that's likely how we operated in our family system. You probably had
Yes.
to tantrum at the table to finish your
Yes.
dinner, or things of that
Yes.
nature. And I think I operate that way just like professionally. So if I have students, in general, or even just professionally for like state associations or national associations, professional, like you don't want to give like so much energy and attention and engagement with the outliers. So if you're getting in an argument with someone on a list, over email, or if in
Mhm.
my case, like if a student is making a lot of noise, I'm not going to engage in a really ineffective way, because that's
Be
I'm
be well,
because
because that's going to make that behavior the other person's doing more likely to happen,
that's
and I
exactly
think
right.
that's what people, again, when not that they were supposed to, like, we had to go to a lot of school to learn about this stuff,
We
right? That's why we're sharing it on a
we're,
podcast, 'cause we want everyone to know. Like,
yeah,
having um, this foundational understanding of how behavior is influenced and shaped is really helpful in, like, deciding like, well, how do I want to interact with this
well,
situation?
knowledge is power.
Yeah, it
And
is.
knowledge
It
is power. And
is.
how do I want to interact with it? I love that. Okay, how do I want to interact with it? Because it's not, we don't always want to, and we want to really set some like healthy, good boundaries around, who and how and when we interact. And I think a lot of times if I do some like role playing with some clients, I'm like, oh, it's sounding too psychological. Like, and I get it because they're like, that's
Mhm.
amazing. Can I write that down and say that
Mhm.
to,
Mhm.
my kid or whatever? It's
Sure,
like,
sure,
sure,
sure.
you could write it down, but it's like, this just comes with practice.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Well, and I like that you said a few minutes ago, like, it's important that nobody expects that you're going to execute these behavioral interventions in some, robotic, perfect manner that
Right.
like we're like, Pete and I say it all the time, like we're humans, like we're
We're human.
messy, right? And
Yeah.
we live in a messy human world.
Yeah.
So, you know,
Yeah.
like,
And we mess up, which is like, I'm so thankful for that, like messing up, because I'm imperfect. And that might also be helpful for people to hear. So one of the things I'll say to clients is like, yes, this sounded really good in here, and I am a psychologist with training in this, and as long as you give it a shot, that's already better than nothing.
Absolutely, absolutely. And there's a quote that I often think about and I share with my students when I'm beginning to train them in the basics of behavioral science, which I hope I am attributing this correctly. One of my mentors used to say it, and I think she said Marsha Linehan said it,
Yeah.
who is the creator of dialectical behavior therapy, and she always says no one is immune to the principles of behaviorism, not even therapists.
Yeah.
And the reason that I say this to students is because again, we could say not even anybody, not even parents, not even teachers, not
Yeah.
even,
Fill in the blank.
Yeah, fill in the blank.
Yeah.
The point being that everything we do is behavior.
Yeah.
Everything everybody else does is behavior. And
Yeah.
we're constantly influencing each other and shaping each other. And when we have this knowledge about what behavioral science says works more effectively and
Yeah.
what doesn't work so effectively, we have the opportunity to choose behaviors that might make things go a little bit more smoothly.
And no one is immune to behaviorism. And so what I hope that listeners think about with this is, as the holiday season's upon us, just think about what is it that you're trying to reinforce, right? What are you trying to punish? And can you work to at least raise awareness around extinguishing some behaviors without dancing and engaging in the unhealthy activities and communications that we often do? This has been When East Meets West. I'm Dr. Pete Economo.
And I'm Dr. Nikki Rubin. Be present, be brave.
This has been When East Meets West. All material is based on opinion and educational training of Drs. Pete Economo and Nikki Rubin.
Content is for informational and educational purposes only.